Welcome to the Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe County's experimental online educational series. We're doing this because currently all of our education programming is shut down because of the 2020 coronavirus pandemic. Now, there'll be nothing fancy about this video. It'll be like the PowerPoint presentation you would see if you attended in person, except the audio is pre-recorded. We're hoping that my personality and information will make up for the lack of seeing me in person. Please note there's a pause at the beginning and end of each slide to allow the PowerPoint audio to transition without hiccups. We're grateful to all our sponsors, but this week we're especially grateful to Brunk Auctions, world-class consignments and exceptional results. But I'm being rude. Who am I? I'm James Vaughn. I'm a member of the Preservation Society and one of the owners of Chiles House. We're the guys who got the house on the National Register of Historic Places. I'm a history buff, and I also tend to talk fast. But the nice thing about video is you can always pause and go back, or get more information about Chiles Avenue and the history of Kenilworth at our website, chiles-house.com. This week's video was produced during the protest against the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police. Sadly, it echoes the period we will be covering this week in Chiles and Asheville history from 1940 to today and the end of segregation in Asheville. We started our history around the same period as the last worldwide pandemic, the 1918 to 1920 Spanish flu. We paused last week with the controversial elections of 1928, in which voter suppression of black voters was a factor, and touched lightly on the struggles of American families in one of the greatest economic crises our country had faced until then. Herbert Hoover, elected in 1928, who rose to prominence as a businessman, was considered even in his time as a racist, despite the Lincoln roots of the Republican Party. He purged the party of black leaders. He opposed government intervention in the economy, and the stock market responded positively, rising rapidly during his administration's first year before the crash led to historic levels of unemployment. Back on Chiles Avenue, Kenilworth and Asheville struggled through the Depression, and no new homes would be built on Chiles Avenue between 1928 and 1939. We will walk down Chiles Avenue one last time and look at the progress that happened architecturally and socially. We start at the corner of Kenilworth and Chiles, not at a home, but a church. Kenilworth Presbyterian Church was organized in the midst of the Depression around 1934. By the 1950s, membership had swelled to more than 500 members, and many social notices of homes on Chiles revolved around meetings of the various women's circles associated with the church. By 2010, membership had dwindled to 35 members. But it found its voice and role as a community center of sorts for Kenilworth. Its offices are rented by local artists, and community groups hold meetings there. The social hall, with an address of 4 Chiles Avenue, is known as Kenilworth Center and has hosted many community functions like bingo, and would have been the setting for this presentation before COVID-19 shut down our live programming. The church hosts an annual Martin Luther King program, and in 1993, the original building behind the church and social hall became the home of Loving Food Resources. This nonprofit was organized at All Souls Episcopal as a food pantry for those with HIV/AIDS in the early 1990s. They expanded their mission to include home hospice patients. We heard about this charity from one of the many LGBT families living on Chiles Avenue and throughout Kenilworth. This address caused me several moments of frustration during my research, as newspaper articles consistently confused this address for 8 Chiles. It wasn't clear if there was a house here prior to 1949 or just sloppy reporting. Articles on different days would refer to the same event with 2 different addresses. The Crouch family initially lived here until the Kubota family made it a sort of mini community center with meetings of La Leche and for other topics. Chiles Avenue was well represented in World War II by men and women. It even resulted in a love story here at 7 Chiles Avenue. Harry Kirby built this house in 1947. He was blinded in Normandy and met his wife, a nurse, while recuperating at Walter Reed Army Hospital. He was commandeered back to take up his old job at Hajoka Plumbing on Swannanoa by John Chiles, son of Jake and Leah Chiles, and then given or sold the land at 7 Chiles. John took Kirby down to Tryon to make drawings of a house he'd liked there before being blinded. They adapted the plan for this house, and though blind, he supervised crews doing plumbing work for Hajoka, including the house next door across Ravenna at number 9 Chiles. Number 9 is a Cape Cod style. After World War II, there was an incredible need for housing, especially as the baby boom took off. So the Cape Cod style was a colonial-era architectural style, boxy, low to the ground, with a sharply pitched roof and narrow eaves, and it was adapted because it lent itself to mass production on a fast time scale. Typically, they were 2-bedroom with a bathroom tucked behind the kitchen. Initially, the kitchen was across the front of the house, but it was soon adapted to put the kitchen at the back for privacy and so mom could watch the kids in the backyard. The perfect starter homes for a starter family. The only structure built in the 1960s was this apartment building at 12 Chiles. Like Kingledor's and Newlywed Nest from last week, it was a home for people who were renting or just starting out their lives. By the 1960s, most articles with an address were reduced to real estate sales, marriage, births, deaths, and crime. And by the 1970s and 80s, there were a number of crimes reported along Chiles Avenue, as drugs and drug-related crime became prevalent here as in other parts of Asheville. One of the less endearing times when we say, if it happened in Asheville, it happened on Chiles Avenue. Another unfortunate trend that crept up by the 1960s and 70s was decaying historical properties. 22 Chiles, home of Paramount Pictures entrepreneur Diamond Lynch, had become a decaying wreck by the 1960s. In '65, this beautiful home was condemned and threatened with destruction. It was spared on the condition that the owner, Dan Mosler, let the city clean it up and make repairs at the owner's expense. Letters to the editor complaining about the boarded-up ruin appeared in the local newspaper. The Chiles children and their friends noted on our Facebook page how they used to sneak in this old house and look around. The repairs bought the house 8 more years, but again, it faced the wrecking ball, and this time there was no reprieve. In 1973, the city council ordered it demolished. Mosler threatened the council, saying, "I ain't going to let any bunch of politicians tear it down. It's never hurt or harmed anyone." In fact, he went further and threatened the council, saying he would take a gun in his hand and vowed there's going to be bloodshed. Sadly, the house was torn down, and the land was sold a few years later to a company that would build a group home in its place. The cruel irony of that was that the home at one point had been repurposed as a nursing home to care for people. If only it had held out for a few more years. In 1978, the Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe County was formed to save and encourage adaptive reuse of buildings like 22 Chiles. PSABC has an Endangered Properties Committee whose job it is to take note of places like this and to keep an eye on them and intervene when appropriate and necessary to try and save them. Imagine how many of these beauties we lost, and how many were saved because of them. Another traditional architectural style that was adapted in the 1940s for modern living was the colonial. It said these homes were built with a modern housewife in mind. Many were single-story to avoid having to run up and down stairs. But soon 2-story versions were being built because as those boomer families started growing, you needed at least 3 bedrooms to accommodate those 2.5 children. The bedrooms and bathroom moved upstairs, allowing for a dining room again. You'll note the grand front porches began to disappear as people moved to their backyards for entertaining, and the word cookout joined the American vocabulary. A big picture window across the front was inefficient and drove AC and heating sales, but allowed people like the Mrs. Kravitz of the era to look out on each other. Eat-in kitchens, in addition to or instead of dining rooms, made things more efficient for, quote, mother. Her array of modern machinery made her more like a factory worker than the traditional role of domestic supervisor of the help. Women like Mrs. Bernard Smith Jr., always identified by their husband's name, at 25 Chiles, honored as Woman of the Week, as much for her efficient running of the household as her civic work. Architecture began to adapt people to it rather than adapt the building to the circumstances. Many earlier homes were built stacked and tight to take full advantage of the heat rising from the single warming source, a fireplace, or heating oil and coal furnaces. These homes were designed to make women efficient and make entertaining more selective, not to mention starting to give priority to the family car. In 1957, we start to get a glimpse of the next phase of Asheville growth at 176 Chiles. That's a big leap in house numbering for some odd reason. 41 Chiles stands right next door, and this house is given an even-numbered address. 176 is built in a, quote, modern cottage style, a picturesque lake house or vacation-style home. While many homes were second or vacation homes for people escaping the regional summer or coming to Asheville for health reasons, these homes are the main home, and with the intent of embracing the fact that they live in a vacation destination. Naturally, this home on the even side of the street was given an odd-numbered address. This third home at the end of the street technically has a Lakewood address, but it faces Chiles Avenue, and it's just too interesting to pass up. This house is one of the kit homes. That is, they were comprised of steel sheets designed to be assembled in place with an electric screwdriver. Sort of IKEA meets mobile home. There were many of these, and in 1947, a model home was set up in Asheville so people could come see the modern, livable home of steel. This one was built in 1948, and it is a ranch style with New England colonial roots. Ranch homes were beginning to be the new American style. Let's backtrack around the bend to the section of homes from 28 to 30 Chiles Avenue. These three homes are all variations on the ranch style. Unlike Cape Cod and Colonial, which were adaptations of previous architectural styles, the ranch was something new and purely American. It was geared towards indoor-outdoor living. It had open floor plans and semi-enclosed patios. This was possible thanks to the mass adoption of heating and cooling systems. Extensive use of glass doors and big windows brought the outdoors in. Born in the sprawling deserts of the American Southwest, the style was quickly adopted around the country, and the influence of the ranch continues today. This ranchification, if you will, happens to many homes no matter their age, but especially to homes built in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Do-it-yourselfers with a need for more space or open floor plans have changed, remodeled, and adapted many homes, mostly thanks to watching HGTV. The thing is, while we easily think of homes from prior to World War II as historic homes, these 40s to 60s homes are now in the category of being historic homes themselves. In fact, 50 years is the rough age, and so homes built in 1970 could now begin to be listed and registered as historic places. The problem is, to qualify, many of them have to be architecturally intact to the era they were built. Adding porches and additions, changing windows, removing those internal walls that break up the flow are rendering them ineligible for recognition. Unless it passed through families who resisted the idea to make their own changes, the only homes that tend to remain intact are those owned by one family for many decades. They either couldn't afford to make modifications or didn't want them. But homes like that also tend to be in serious disrepair when they are finally bought by people who value the architectural integrity that was preserved. We don't know how old houses might have felt about these new and uncomfortably different-looking buildings popping up next door, and sometimes that applied to the people as well. Next door at 32 Chiles, in 1973, Titus and Ruth Laverne Glover moved in. Nothing new about new people moving into a neighborhood, but the Glovers were African American. We met their daughter Diane when we moved into our house in 2016 and didn't think anything about it. But in researching this week's video, I met with Dr. Dwight Mullen, a professor at UNC Asheville. He told me that he came to Asheville in 1984 to take a professorship there. What they didn't tell him was that he was going to be breaking the color barrier and integrating the faculty in 1984. It was the last college in North Carolina not to have integrated its faculty and was under a court order to do so. He told me initially he had trouble finding housing because people didn't want to rent to a black man. In 1986, he bought a home in Kenilworth off Chiles Avenue and mentioned that to a black colleague. Kenilworth, they asked. White Kenilworth or black Kenilworth? Referring to the Brackettville area across Kenilworth Road near the St. John A. Baptist Church. He didn't know and had to rely on telling them the street before being told, "Oh, you're in White Kenilworth." I've not found any restrictions in the deeds I've looked at along Chiles Avenue, but that doesn't mean it wasn't happening by practice. John Chiles noted in his oral history that he always felt Kenilworth was desegregated and welcoming. That was echoed in a video by George Gibson, an African-American Kenilworth resident we will hear about shortly. Dr. Mullen told me that when he moved in, he knew of only 2 black families in, quote, White Kenilworth, although there were more. The first, Reverend Charles Mosley, lived across the street from him and had moved there in 1981, and the Glovers on Chiles Avenue. I tried to reach out to Laverne Glover to see if I could verify if hers was indeed the first black family to integrate Chiles Avenue, but I wasn't able to reach her. Glover is a poet and known for her professional and volunteer work with medical organizations in the area, including the Red Cross and Mission Hospital. Glover was an employee at Mission when she became aware of a preschool-age resident of the new Irene Wortham Center. Kesha Young was born with serious disabilities and medical problems. When Laverne found out the smiling child had nowhere to spend Thanksgiving, she and Titus became her guardians and gave her the love she deserved. Kiki, as she liked to call herself, would die at 22 years of age, and a scholarship was established in her honor to help students planning careers in healthcare. News accounts of Laverne often use the phrase works tirelessly when referring to her efforts, no matter the cause. This is a good moment to jump back 170 years and take a quick look at the history of African Americans in Asheville. A few minutes and a few slides can't put the slightest dent in that topic, and I've listed in the slides the websites of a few excellent resources I found that do the topic true justice. As it is my presentation, I'm going to call out a few things that I found surprising as a white Yankee in his mid-50s. No matter how hard I've tried, I've been told that being born in Southern California does not make me Southern as well for some reason. I'd heard about the Vance birthplace and the story of slavery there, which fits with what most of us are taught about slavery and its association with plantations. And some historians have tried to claim that means there wasn't much slavery in the Asheville area. But the ads in the local newspaper tell a different story. And I learned that Asheville's tourism depended on slavery, as cooks, housekeepers, bellmen, waiters, and others that people saw and encountered in the hotels and restaurants were actually slaves. Pack Square, where the courthouse once stood, where the Vance Monument stands, was a site for slave auctions and markets. While slavery itself ended, these same jobs were held by the same African Americans, only now they could set up their own businesses and in their own names. It was weird for me to hear that as late as the mid-1980s, Dr. Mullins said he would see African Americans, usually women, lined up along the same spot in Pack Square to be picked up by white employers to work for them for the day or perhaps longer. Black people were free, but it was still white people setting the terms. Jim Crow laws were passed here, of course, by 1900, and Pack Square had separate water fountains and restrooms like this one pictured. Things slowly began to change, and after the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court ruling, school desegregation was becoming the law. Back on Chiles Avenue and in Kenilworth, it was 1961, and the schools in Asheville were still segregated. Ann and John Chiles, who had bought the family home back in 1951, and their neighbors across the street at 26 Chiles, Walter and Nan Boggs, were working with black families in Kenilworth to integrate their local school, Newton Elementary. According to Dr. Mullins, these families, white and black, had offered up their children to lead integration. An informal group of parents worked behind the scenes with the school board to make it happen. In July 1961, 11 children from the Chambers, Ray, Hemphill, and Gibson families applied for transfer to the white elementary school in the Kenilworth neighborhood. I believe things were expected to go well, but the school board decided to change the plans last minute, and only children up to the 3rd grade were to be allowed. That meant 6 of the 11 would be denied because they were too old. Jesse Ray of Ray Funeral Home spoke out in opposition to adapting a new policy without the chance for input. School board president Mrs. D.R. Prince said the policy had been adopted with the best interest of the community and the Negro in mind. Only 5 children were to be admitted. When the first day of school came, the media was actively discouraged from covering the story. A news camera crew from New York was convinced not to come down. Police drove by to monitor things, but unlike other places, there were no protests or riots, and Asheville became the 7th city in North Carolina to integrate its elementary schools. High schools would take more time, and not without greater controversy and protest. I'm told much of the controversy from the high school integration came from black students who were brought to the white school and just dropped in without any of the aspects of their old black high school, Stevens Lee from our Ronald Green video, allowed. Their academic and other clubs were not allowed. Their trophies were left behind. Teachers, assistants, and other staff were not transferred, and many lost their jobs. The message was clear. We may be forced to let you in, but this is our house and our rules. So it should be no surprise that black high school students ended up leading the charge for desegregation of the downtown business community of Asheville. The attempt to discourage media coverage had more to do with Asheville's tourism industry than any desire to make integration go smoothly. Businesses, hotels, and city officials were afraid of the riots, demonstrations, and bad publicity happening in other parts of the country. The message around publicly since the end of the Civil War had been, "We happily get along and have no problems here," something described as Asheville's veneer of racial harmony. And it wasn't just the white community who wanted to see that facade maintained, it seems, according to some sources, but a group of black students from Stevens-Lee formed a group called A-Score, Asheville Student Committee on Racial Equality. They met in the back of a jewelry store owned by William Rowland. He became one of their adult advisors and earnestly counseled them to use patience and integrity, and above all, peaceful methods to integrate local businesses. When the time came, groups of black students quietly and politely entered local places like Woolworths and the movie theater, and took seats at the counter or white-only seating areas. When inevitably asked by the staff or manager to leave, they would politely ask, "Is this really what you want to do?" When told yes, they politely left. These displays of determination were enough to bring the business community and city leaders to meet with the students. The white community was terrified these quiet moments could become what they saw in other places, and as Dr. Mullins and other sources put it, segregation disappeared nearly overnight and integration became the norm. Jim Crow signs came down. Harry Winter, a local Jewish merchant, hired black clerks for his store and quietly went around to other stores encouraging them to do so as well, and had them all start work the same day in an integration fait accompli. Not all businesses went along, and Winn-Dixie grocery store was hit with protests and a boycott for refusing to hire black employees. At first, even black families crossed the picket line. Not all of the black adults in town approved of what A-Score was doing and were worried about backlash. But eventually, at the urging of church pastors, they joined the students, and as did many white supporters. After more than a year, the store eventually relented, and one of the A-Score leaders became the first black employee. Again, this is the shallowest of dives, and there are many people alive today who were there, who I tried to reach out to, but the pandemic or health issues made many of them unavailable. One of those was A-Score leader Marvin Chambers. He lives in a house right on the border between white Kenilworth and black Kenilworth, on the white side. I've spent the last 4 years that I've lived here occasionally walking or driving by and seeing him and waving, having no idea that a hero of that movement lives just one street away. I first came across his name when I became involved with the South Asheville Cemetery. But what about the present and our future? Lots are being subdivided on Chiles Avenue and other streets. 36 Chiles once sat on a large lot, and these two homes were built on either side of it. They fit in nicely in the neighborhood and are a welcome addition, and we can thank zoning laws for that. But it can also lead to challenges. As more infill happens, some begin to question the impact it can have on the surrounding neighborhoods. Some say more homes mean more traffic, and if you recall the photo of the width of Chiles Avenue, it can be a valid point. Others note that housing is scarce, especially housing that is within the price range of young families. Accessory dwelling units converted from garages or carriage houses can provide affordable housing, such as rental units, that help people afford the mortgage and upkeep of these old homes. They provide places for caretakers to live, keeping people out of nursing homes, which the current pandemic shows can become dangerous places in the wrong circumstances. But neighbors don't want to see the character of their neighborhood change too much either. That can be a challenge. This is the rendering of a home proposed for 18 Chiles per Realtor.com. These are the homes on either side. Homes don't have to be duplicates, but they have to harmonize and not appear out of scale or too far afield architecturally. That can be subjective. Does this home fit in with what you've seen on Chiles Avenue? People may reasonably answer differently. How about this home under construction? And let me note that it is right across a side street from this building, which is next door to Kingledor's. Looking farther down the road, we may experience clashes between those sincerely wishing to protect our history and those sincerely desiring to preserve our future. Preservationists, especially those who make determinations about historic designation, realized long ago that the kitchens and bathrooms of 100 years ago just aren't going to fly with families today. So there is leeway when evaluating them. But as we consider climate change and the steps we're going to take to preserve the planet, we'll need to find ways to accommodate upgrades to old buildings as well as new. Windows, from what I pick up in conversations, are one of the biggest issues and are often cited as a factor for turning down an application for historic designation or approving repairs to locally designated homes. Putting in energy-efficient windows seems to make sense until you stop and consider how they quickly undo the architectural integrity of an historic home. And how and where do you place solar panels on a historic home like this example you've been looking at? No doubt many changes will take place inside and outside our homes due to changing circumstances. The ranch influence of open floor plans is wonderful until you end up working from home during a pandemic and having to concentrate or hold professional calls with the rest of the family life happening in the background of your Zoom call. Many employees may never go back to central offices. That's going to impact the design of new homes, but especially older homes. Additions or building new walls to reconfigure spaces will all have an impact and will need to be considered by both homeowners and preservationists. And that's just one example of how we need to start planning ahead to determine what is important to preserve and what we can allow to adapt with the times. Just look at Chiles Avenue, and you can see how the architecture changed with the times and the needs of families over just the last 100 years. Progress is constant on Chiles Avenue and everywhere else. From the first log cabins at the start of Chiles Avenue to the modern vacation-style home at the end, it's only 0.4 miles in physical distance. But it spans over 100 years of architecture and stories. Because to me, architecture is the book cover for the stories that happen inside. I tell the stories of people so you can understand the architecture better and why we want to preserve those memories. The stories of pioneering business people, artists, people from different backgrounds, people who helped those around them, and those who fought to keep them out. The smallest home can have the biggest stories. So preservation falls short when it only seeks to save the biggest house of the most important wealthy person of an era. What we decide to preserve will tell future generations much about us and our time. Not all stories that we keep are good ones, and that's okay, because it will help those that follow be able to appreciate where they have grown from, and perhaps remind them what is the important thing to do, the right thing to do. And that will create a legacy to be studied another 100 years beyond them. What will be our legacy? It starts on your street. It continues through Asheville and Buncombe County. Today, with this video series, many people in my neighborhood will look back and say, it happened on Chiles Avenue. But the future depends on us.